Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith. And in this video, we're going to build a calendar widget using FullCalendar.js and data from the Google Calendar API. So FullCalendar is a JavaScript library that's open source, and it has a ton of different options for displaying data in a month view, a week, or a day, just a list of events. There's options to integrate different click events when you select an event or want to add a new one. So it handles all of that stuff for you and makes it easy to build a calendar into any other app or website. And then for the data, we're going to connect to the Google Calendar API, which if you've used their API before or any of their APIs, you know it can be a little tricky to get the authentication set up and to get that refresh token to work. Then once you're actually connected, you got to make sure you have the right scopes, or even though the API is authorized, you still can't see that particular resource. So there's a lot to it. Today we'll show you how to create a project in the Google Cloud Console, how to enable the API for that project, and then we'll create a set of credentials and use that to set up a authenticated data source in Appsmith. And once we have that, then we can start using the API to list records, create new events, and then we'll build that custom widget around it to display the events using FullCalendar.js. So let's get started. First, we're going to create a new project in the Google Cloud Console. All right, I'm in my Google Cloud Console, and the first thing you want to do is go to this drop down at the top here and start a new project. So you might not have any projects in here at all yet, but if you do, just keep an eye on which project is selected. So I'm going to create a new project and name it GCal Friday Tech Workshop Video, and then click Create. So it's creating the project. It's not done yet. And it's still selected to this other project called Appsmith.com. Now that it's done creating it, it's still not selected. So just be real careful before you go to this next step to enable the API. You want to make sure that you select the correct project first. So you got to actually create the project, give it a few seconds to finish creating, and then come back here and select it. Now that I'm on the right project, now you go to enable the API. So create the project, give it a name, give it a second. Then you'll come here to enable and search through the APIs here. We'll look for calendar and select Google Calendar and then enable. So you want to make sure you're on the right project first and then enable it. Now, this makes the API, it's possible to use it in this project, but it doesn't create credentials yet. You don't have everything that you need to start using it, but it does at least make it possible for this one project. So then the next step is you create some credentials, and you'll see a shortcut here for that. But if you leave this screen, you can get to it from the credentials here. And the first time you go to create credentials, it's going to have you walk through some extra steps about setting up the OAuth consent screen if you haven't done that yet. So you can either do all this at once or kind of go through it twice here, and it'll prompt you to do the OAuth consent screen first and then make the credentials. But it's a little tricky to get used to the first time that you do this in a project. You're going to see one set of questions here when you choose OAuth 2. And then the second and every other time after that, once the consent screen's done, then that flow is a little different. So if you don't see exactly the same thing that I'm doing here, just make sure you're starting in a new project. If it's an existing one, you might already have that consent screen set up. Now, you could use an API key. It's a little easier, but also less secure. We're going to use the OAuth flow, which is the most secure, and it works best with our data sources. So I'm selecting OAuth, and you'll see that before I can actually create these credentials, it's telling me I have to set up this consent screen. So that might already be done if you're doing this in a existing project. So we're setting up, we started on credentials here, but it's sent us over to the OAuth section. So now we're going to set it up as internal, and that makes a couple of the fields not required. You don't have to put in a logo and a few other things. So we'll go to set this OAuth screen up and create it. And then we're giving it an app name and support email. There's two places you need to email here. So put in the app name, your support email, and then also at the very bottom here for developer contact. So there's two different places at a minimum that are required where you need an email. And the rest of this is optional, not needed for this internal one that we're doing. So you can leave all those blank and click Save and Continue. And then you can add scopes, but you can also do this through the API when you go to connect from Appsmith. So we're going to skip past this and look at the summary. This is just the consent screen. We're still on this section here. Okay, so we've finished setting up our consent screen. Now I'm going back to credentials, and you can see I started by selecting OAuth, and we went through all of that, and now there's nothing under the OAuth 2 clients. This really took me a minute to figure out what was going on here because it's only different that first time that you create credentials in a project. Every other time, once you've got the OAuth screen, then it'll actually take you to the right flow and give you the right form to create the OAuth 2 credentials. So just wanted to point that out. If you go straight here, you're going to have to go to it twice, or just go do the OAuth screen first. So now we're going to create the actual credentials. This time it's showing me a different option because the OAuth screen's done. So you want to select web application. We'll give this a name as well. Okay, and then you need a value right here for the redirect. This is the URL that you want the user to go back to after they click accept or allow for Google. They're going to select their Google account, say, yes, I authorize it to have calendar access, and then you want it to go back to your app. But it's not the specific app URL. It's the same URL for every app. And you can get to that. We're going to switch over to Appsmith now. So go to create a new data source. And you want to choose the plus here to create a data source, and then authenticated API. So not the regular REST API. The authenticated one saves the credentials on the Appsmith server. So you've got your own self-hosted server with the credentials there, and then the app itself won't have the API key in it. So we're going to authenticated API. We'll name this GCal Joseph. I like to put my name in here because I'm working with a lot of other developers, so we know who owns each data source. And then for the authentication type, change this to OAuth 2. And just scroll down and you'll see actually OAuth 2 and then select authorization code. And then this field will show you can copy the redirect URL right here. So we'll get to the rest of this form in a minute. But if you need this URL, the easiest place is just start creating the data source. Go back to your setup here for the credentials and paste this in. And then we'll finish this section and get the values to go put in that next form. So here it's just select web app, give it a name, and then we've got this URL that goes to appsmith.com API v1 data sources authorize. And it's the same for every app. So we go ahead and add that. And now this consent screen exists. It is ready to let an end user choose to approve it and end up getting some credentials. But at this point, it's just a client ID and secret. And a user has to go through that OAuth flow to actually start using them. So I'm going to leave this page open so we can come back here and copy these values. If you need to, you can get to it again. Some platforms don't ever let you copy that secret again. They'll only show it one time. In this case, you can actually come back and get it. So if you do close it, just click here on your credentials and go to manage it and open it up. But I'm going to leave this open here so we can come back and copy it. Now you want to go to the data source itself. We're going to start filling all this out. And I've actually got a tutorial I just published on this. There's a lot of different options that are needed in here. They got to be just right. And so instead of trying to go through each one and back and forth from the API docs, I've just got it all in one spot. We're going to copy it from this tutorial that I just published. Okay, so all of the settings that we're putting into the data source, that starts right here. You've got the URL. This is the root URL for every API request that this data source is going to use. You actually don't need any of the headers here. It's all going to be in the authentication section. So then with this set to authorization code, we need the access token URL. That's the next thing. So I've got the OAuth 2 and authorization code is selected. Those were defaults there already. So here's the next one I need. And then the client ID and secret, that's coming from over here. And make sure you don't let these get exposed or show it on screen like I'm doing now. I'm going to delete these before the video's out. So if they do get exposed, just regenerate or delete that set of credentials and generate a new set. Okay, so the next thing is scope. And like I said before, you can set this at the project level so that anybody using it always has that scope, or you can make it specific to the individual apps using it and just request the scope at the time that you're setting up the data source. The scope that we need is calendar.events, and you could do just calendar, which would be more permissive. It would give you everything about the calendar, but I'm doing the least permissive that will work for our use case. I want to list events and create events, and everything that I need permission for is in that one scope. So now to the authorization URL. And again, all this stuff is in the Google Docs as well, but it's kind of spread out, and I like just having everything right here in a list to copy and paste. And then the last thing that you need is 2 sets of custom authentication parameters here. The first one, access type offline. That's going to make sure that the refresh token works for your app. You know, when the user's like getting their request and then you want it to keep doing a refresh for you in the background and not have to go through the OAuth flow again. So access type offline. And then the next one is prompt is consent. And this just tells it to show that consent screen to give you a chance to review it and decide if you want to allow it or not. There's a few other options here that you don't have to change. The defaults should be good. So you got the URL. You can skip that whole next section of headers and parameters, and then everything else is under the authentication here. Make sure you select OAuth 2 and authorization code, and then the rest of these options will show. So that looks good. I'm going to click Save and Authorize, and it should redirect you to your Google account to select which one you want to use, and then show you the name of the app. This is the consent screen that we set up. And so it's saying that the one scope that I requested is to view and edit events on the calendar. So we'll click allow on that. And now it's sending us back to that redirect URL, which is the Appsmith data source. And you can see it was successful. So it is ready to start using. We're connected, it's authorized, and we can start using the API to pull a list of our events, to edit events, or whatever we want to do. So next, we'll create an API under this data source. And you can do it right here with this new API button because we're viewing this data source. So it will make one under this data source with this URL as the root. So if I click new, you see this blue bar around it, and anything that I do with this data source will have those credentials and this root URL. Now I'm going to delete this one just to show the other way. From the queries pane here, you select that you want to create a new query or API, and then you select the specific data source that you want it to go under. So when you're viewing the data source already, it's a little different. All right. So here's my new API. I'm going to use this to get events. So I'm going to paste this in here again, but this time I want to get a different calendar instead of primary. I set up a separate calendar just for this demo, and that way we can create some test events on here. So I'm in this new calendar. Let me back out. I created a calendar called API test. You go to the settings after you've created it and just scroll down. I think it's in the integrate calendar section here. There's a calendar ID. So I'm just going to copy this ID and back to our API here. We'll change the primary part in the URL to this calendar ID. And now I'm able to get back that calendar, that API test one that I just made. So it shows the items here in an array, and there's just the one that I've created so far. But what we're going to do is use this API now to list all the events in a table, and then we can use another API to create events. And once we have both those working, then I want to create that interface using FullCalendar.js so we can have like a real calendar interface instead of a table. So next, let's display this event. I've got one event here. I'm going to add a table widget. All right, and we will connect it to that get events query. And inside that .data is an items array. So there's the one event that I've created so far. We can go ahead and add one more and just make sure that it's working and able to see everything here. So okay, so I've got an event there, and if I rerun that API, should see two events. All right, so we got a test calendar set up. We can list events. Okay, now I started out with a test calendar that doesn't have anything on it. I want to add something. Let's go a couple months in the future here, and I'll add something that'll show up on a different page of the calendar. So now when I'm looking at the list here, in a table, it's fine if it's just a list. But if you're looking at a calendar, it's not even going to show unless you're on the right month. So we're going to want a date filter up here to be able to pick a start and end date and pass that to the API. So next, I'm going to add two date pickers. And I'm just going to change both of the names and the labels. So we'll have date start and date end. And this makes it a lot easier when you reference it in the API to be able to know which is which instead of date picker 1 and 2. So back here in the get events query, right now we're just getting all events. So to filter it, there is a query parameter time min and time max. So for time min, we're going to take the value from that first date picker for date start, selected date, and then time max will come from the second one there, end date, dot selected date. And there's one other parameter you should add. So these two will filter all of the events by their start and end date. But if you have a repeating event, it will only show up when you select its first occurrence, when you're filtering on that date range that catches the first one. So we'll add the single events equals true parameter, and this expands those repeat events into individual occurrences for everyone that falls in your date range. So if you don't add this, you'll see some weird results like missing events or things that have a date that's not really in the range you asked for. It seems like the API is broken at first, but once you add this extra parameter here, all those repeat events will just show up as individual ones. So we'll go ahead and run this, and now we are getting back, well, here's our date range, and it's not showing anything. So let's back this up to last month, because I think I had something in August. And if I run it again, there we go. So we got one event now in this date range. Now, if you want this to run every time you change the date, we can just set the on date change here, or on date selected, to rerun that query. So we'll get events every time this date's changed and do the same thing over here. All right. And now I can adjust these filters on the fly here. I'm just going to get everything by getting last year and next year here. Okay, so every time you change these filters, the table will update. So now we can list events. If you wanted, you could even add like another drop down here for calendar and filter that parameter here with like your list of IDs. But I'm just going to stick to this one calendar. I think we're good on listing events. So now I want to create an event. So I'm going to use a JSON form and I want like a button and a modal to open it up. So I'm starting with a button here and set the on click to open a modal, show modal. And then if you don't have one yet, when you go to select a modal, there's a shortcut for new modal, which creates it and links the two. So the button opens that modal now. And now I'm going to use a JSON form, and it has its own close or submit and reset buttons. So if you're building the form one widget at a time for each input, you can use those. But in this case, with the JSON form, it's got its own buttons. All right. So now I need some JSON to feed this form to generate it in the structure of the API. And I've got that in the tutorial here. You go to create the form and just copy this. So this is some JSON that looks just like what the API is expecting when you create an event. And I just added this moment.timezone.guess to pre-fill the time zone here on the dates. Now, notice how the start and end date, these are objects. Summary is just a string, but then for start, it's an object that has a date time and a time zone in separate fields in the side object. So you can't just send the time zone string, or the date string with the time zone all in one. And when you go to create it, if you leave out the time zone, you're going to get an error. So just paste this in here. It'll generate the form with the right structure for, the majority of the fields that you need. You might want to check out the API and add a few other fields for, which calendar you add an event to and different things like that. Okay, so that's generated the form, but this is still a text input for the date and the time zone. So for the date, we'll go to the start one, and notice how this is nested here. In the JSON, it's nested. There's start dot time zone. In the JSON form here, it renders that on the front end, and also in the settings. So inside the start, which is a single column of the JSON form, inside here is a new list of fields because it's nested. The settings are nested just like the data. So I'm going into the date time setting that's inside start, changing this to a date picker, and I'm going to change the format to ISO because that's what this API is expecting. So that one's a date picker. Now we'll go back out to the end date, into its date time. Same thing, making this a date picker and ISO format. All right, and then for the time zone, it needs to be included, but the user, they're not going to know all the right values and exactly like what format to type. So I've got something else here in the tutorial you can copy. This snippet will generate a list of all of the time zones and then turn it into a list of select options for the select widget. So we're going to change this time zone. I think I'm on end still, so we'll do this one first. And I'm changing this field to a select, and then that makes it a drop down. And we'll paste this snippet in here, and that generates a list of all of the time zones in an array here. And you can see there's over 100. There's a lot to try to type out yourself. So this just generates the list for you. And now we'll do the same thing here on the start into the time zone. And make this one a select. Give it some options. All right, so we have a form. It's got all the fields that we need to create an event. Now I need an API to actually send the data. So back to the query, and I'm going to add another API under that same data source. This time we're using a post request to create an event. All right, and then for the URL, you go to save the form. Let me copy this. So it's calendars v3, and then instead of primary, I want to get that ID again for my calendar. Okay. And then the text here, this is a little confusing, but in Google's API, they use the word summary in the API to refer to the part of an event that you would call title, the thing that you see across the top here. However, they call it text in the URL parameter. So they're calling it three different things. But when you go to create an event for the title, we're taking that field called summary because that's what the API calls it on the back end. And the URL parameter name is text. And then the other parameter I'm using here is send updates equals all. That just says take every email that's in the attendees list and send a notification to everybody. So let's go ahead and, okay, not quite ready to run it yet. We need a body. So this is really easy. Now for the body with the JSON form, if you set the form up right using the exact same data structure that the API expects, like we did, then you can just take the JSON form data, and that's it. That's the entire body of the API. So you don't have to do a bunch of bindings in here. If you use a regular form instead of a JSON form, or build that one input at a time, then you're going to have property name, colon, and then a widget name, and then property name, colon, widget name, and have to type all that out and connect everything. So the JSON form will work just like this as long as you structure that data the way that the API is expecting it. So I think we're about ready to test this now. We got a create event, a post. Let's tie the API to the submit button now on the form. So right here for submit, go to the, oh, I'm inside the time zone. So back out to the JSON form main settings, the top level here, and then under events on submit, I want to create an event, and then to actually see it in the table. It won't show immediately. You have to run the callback on success. I want to get events again to see the new record in there, because the last time this query ran, that wasn't in there. And now that modal is still going to be open, but you can use this callback here, which is inside the success. So it's like the callback of a callback here, and just close the modal. So we'll close modal, which is modal1.name. And that way, if we rename the modal later, it'll still get the right one there. So I think that's it. We're ready to test this out. When we click submit, it will create the event. If that's successful, it will get all the events again, and then close this modal. So we have 3 events in there now. And let's put some data in here. Okay, test, pick today, just so we can find it easy. And let's see. There it is. Yeah, so we got one more event now. Can't see the titles, but that is filtering down there. Let's move that summary to the front so we can see it. There. Okay. So I've got 3 that match test here, and could move the attendees up and everything, but we're not really going to make a UI with this table. Just kind of wanted to show the API side first, and now we're going to build an interface for this using a calendar widget. So we don't really need the table to, display much more than this now that we know it's working. So let's see, we can list events, we can filter by the date, and create an event. Now I want to switch over from the Google Calendar API stuff. And second half of this, we're going to focus more on a custom widget using the FullCalendar.js library and how to pass in data from the Google Calendar API, and then create events and tie those two together. So next, adding a new custom widget here. And we'll go to edit the source of the custom widget. And then it comes with this template that's preloaded with some HTML, CSS, and JS here. And it just loops through this default model of tips array that's passed in. So I'm just going to clear all this out so we can start from scratch. Get rid of the CSS as well and the HTML. And then we're going over to JS Deliver. And if you search FullCalendar, you'll notice the highest download one here. This packages in a few other things. If you want, you can get the individual pieces and minimize the weight there if you've got just one or two of the components that you need. But this one, FullCalendar, bundles a bunch of different things with it. So you've got different views and interactions, and everything is already installed. So I'm going to use this library in the custom widget. Here's a snippet we can use to get started. So I'm just going to copy this, put it into the HTML side here. And just like that, we got a calendar rendering. It works out of the box without having to adjust any of this. Sometimes with custom widgets, you need to change a few things from the example before it's rendering. But this one's working. So now I want to move the code from this script tag here. We'll cut this. Going to remove the empty script tags now and put this stuff on the JS side. So in a custom widget, instead of using this method here of waiting for the DOM to load and then having an event listener, instead you want to use the Appsmith on ready. You can see I got a warning here saying that there's no Appsmith on ready function. So I'm going to copy this, put it in here, and now we've got that warning is gone, but it says the on ready expects a function as a parameter. So I'm going to take this function, instead of it being inside of here as a document on ready like event listener, we're going to use the same logic inside here. So I'm just adding an empty arrow function, and then I'll paste this logic from this code inside here. And then we can just get rid of this last bit. Okay, so now it's working and we don't have the warning about the Appsmith on ready. So now we want to pass in some data. And if you look at the example here, it doesn't show you where the data goes. There is a spot here that you can add some data, but it's in this example, it's not there. If you look here at the FullCalendar core one, and this shows there's an events property that you can add to this object that's being used to initialize the calendar. And we're just missing this property here. So I'm going to copy that back here to the custom widget right after the initial view. Okay, so now we've got some data. It is automatically just creating a new event here with new date. So it's like the current date and time. And you can see it showing up here on the calendar. So we're able to load up a calendar and pass in some hard-coded data. It's not dynamic yet. But I want to be able to take that data from Appsmith and pass it into here and then have the widget update. So there's an Appsmith on ready that we already added. There's also Appsmith on model change, and that's the code that you'll run every time the API brings back new events and you want the widget to respond and reload. You can use Appsmith on model change. This also takes a function as a parameter, so we'll put an arrow function in here. And then inside this, I'm going to have some very similar code to this. It's not exactly the same, but there's definitely going to be some overlap and repeats. So I'm going to pull this out of here. I put it in here just to show how this works and with a single on ready. But since we're going to have some duplicate code, just going to pull this out into its own function to load the cal. And then just put all that logic in here. and call that function here. So every time Appsmith is ready, it'll run that load cal function. It's also trying to do it on model change here. And then you'll notice if I comment this out, the on model, the on ready is working, but the on model change isn't. So in here, we should have a test just to make sure that there is some data there in the model. If we look at our reference right now, we're still passing in that tips array. So let's go ahead and swap that out and get our actual event data in here. So back here to the model, if you select the custom widget and go to the default model, just select all that, add some double curly braces, and then you want to pass in an object and any other like properties that you want to add. So events coming from the get events.data.items. And then you can pass in other properties if you want. In this case, I just need the one thing, the events. So if we head back to the custom widget now, you can see the live model is showing those events here. And so I want to put those events in place right here. So at the start of this function, first we'll define those Google Calendar events coming from outside the custom widget. So this will be the Appsmith model events, but that's not in the right format for FullCalendar. Earlier we saw that Google Calendar's API calls it summary instead of title. And then the start and end fields in Google Calendar are an object that have those two properties of the date time and then a separate field for the timestamp, whereas FullCalendar expects all that in a single string, which is what new date is doing here. So I got to map over this data, turn it into this format, and then I can swap out that variable right here. So const FullCal events is the gcal events mapped, and we'll take every event and map it to a new object where there's a title using the event summary, and then we'll have start using the event.start.datetime. Okay, so this variable now should be in this format. And there it is. There's the test events we created on the calendar here earlier. So we're able to pass in that data. Now what happens when the API changes? So if we run it again, we get some new events and we want this calendar to update. That's this on model change. So let's uncomment this. Now that this function is using some data from the model, let's see what happens. And it says can't read undefined reading map. So when it tries to do this map, there's not any events. The very first time there's a model change detected, it's like from the widget first starting up and there's nothing there. I'm going to add some optional chaining here. It's still getting undefined. So what I'm going to do is say, look for these events, look to see if there's something in the model. And if not, just exit right off the bat. Before anything else in this function happens, I'm going to return if there are no FullCalendar events. Sorry, Google Calendar. Okay, so now I don't have this commented out and it's working again because this on model changed. It just gets called too early and there's no data there. So I'm looking for data in the model. If there's no data there, then return, and that stops the rest of this from running. Otherwise, it can go ahead and run this portion, which is initializing the calendar. But then it's a little different when you change the data. The very first time, it is finding that element and running new FullCalendar on that element. But the next time, if the calendar is already loaded and you want to change the data that's in it, you don't want to run this again. You actually have to unload those events and then give it a new source of events. So there's a couple different functions instead of render. It's like remove all events and then add event source, I believe. So we'll have two different ways that we want to handle running this function. If it's inside the onReady, or if it's here in the load cal. So I'm going to use this variable to see if it's been defined yet. So like instead of defining calendar here, const cal, I'm going to start it out here, say let calendar, but not give it a value. Now here, instead of declaring const, it'll just be mutating it. So that's working again, but I want to check to see if it exists. So now that it's defined out here, but it's undefined, it's declared. So I can look to see if it's still undefined. If that's the case, go ahead and do this stuff. If not, then do the other method for the model change. So I'm going to take this chunk here. Both times we will do this test and map the data to the right format. And then if this code will go in the if block here, if there is no calendar. So it's defined here or declared, but its value is undefined. And so this will turn undefined into true. If there is no calendar, then go ahead and do this part to render it. Else, if there already is a calendar, then we want to do calendar dot remove all events, and when the model changes, that'll clear out the events that were there last time and then reload it with the new events. I think it's add source events or add event source, add source events. Let's try this using the full calendar events there. Okay, let me double check. I can't remember if that's source event or event source. It was in the options here. Add event source. Okay, I think I had that backwards. Yeah. All right, now we're going to try changing the data and see if the new value shows up on the calendar widget, if it'll refresh itself. So we got 3 events here, and I got one outside the date range, so it's not showing on this page of the calendar. So let's add one more for today, and we should see 4 in the table and one more show up here. So putting that for today and the end date for today. Okay, so there's the new event in the table and in the custom widget. Cool. So the custom widget, you don't want to have to refresh the entire page and reload the whole widget. You just want it to respond to the incoming data change. So that, we got to select it here. That's this else part. So if the calendar already exists, if you've already defined it and it's working and loaded up, then you just want to remove all the events and then add that source, that same set of data that's here. So we're pretty close now. This is letting us list the data. It updates when records change. But if I wanted to add a new event or select one of these existing ones, we need a way to make the two talk to each other and fire events. So let's check out those docs again on the click events. There's a date click and then an event click. Date is just clicking an empty spot. There's nothing on there. You're just picking a certain date. And then event click is clicking an actual calendar event. So for the date click, let's take a look at the format here. It's just an extra parameter when you initialize the calendar. So full calendar and then whatever options you want in there. And this one is a function saying that when the user clicks the date, you want it to run this function. So back here, we'll say date click, and then I'll give this an arrow function. And I just want to trigger an Appsmith event. So there's Appsmith.trigger event, which takes a string as a parameter. That's the name of the event you want to call outside the custom widget. So this is going to be the date click. When the user clicks a date, I want to run a function outside the widget. So back to the custom widget editor here. And in the event section, there's this on reset click that's built in from the original custom widget template. I'm going to delete that, add a new event. We'll call this date click. And then when the user clicks an empty date here, I want that to open up that modal. So the action for this event will just be to show a modal, select the new modal. Oh, I didn't want to make a new one. Select the existing modal. Here we go. Modal 1. Okay, and there it is. So I'm clicking the custom widget on an empty date, and that is firing an action outside the custom widget, getting me back to this form. So now I can click an empty spot. I could pre-fill this with the date that was clicked. You can also pre-fill it with the existing events, like if the user clicks one of these events and you want to preload that form. So let's add one other event for an event click. So right here, we're creating another event called event click. And with this one, we would want to show a different modal that's preloaded with a similar JSON form, but using data from this event. And we'd have to map it back to that format for the Google API. So I actually just added a modal on accident, so we'll use that one. When the user clicks an existing one, we'll open modal 2. So we got the date click on modal 1, event click, show modal, modal 2. And we should probably name those so we can keep them straight. But here we have modal 1 opening to create a new blank, or to start out with a blank form and create a new event. And then if I click an existing event, okay, this one is not firing because I don't have anything inside the custom widget telling it what to do for that one. So back here, there's the date click, and it's running the function date click, and then we're missing event click. So this one will be another arrow function, and this time we'll use appsmith.trigger event date click. Okay. So now we should be able to do both. Clicking a blank spot brings up the blank form, and clicking an existing event. Okay, that is back to modal 1. Let me see. Still modal 1. Event click, date click. Oh, yeah, that's what I told it to do. I did it wrong here. Event click. Cool. There's modal 2. All right, so you can add another JSON form here and use that to fill it with the details of the existing event so you can edit it. But kind of at time here, I don't have enough time to run through and do every single feature of it, but we got the data from the Google Calendar API, showed how to create those credentials, and then a data source in Appsmith so that you can start working with your Google Calendar data, and then how to display and interact with that data in the custom widget. And the rest of this is pretty straightforward now that this much is done. So I'll put the code out there. If anybody else wants to pick up and finish this off as like a full interactive CRUD app for Google Calendar, it'll be available. But thanks again for watching. I hope this has been helpful. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.